Welcome, everyone. Pleased to have you with us here today for our 69th episode of This Is CDR. This Is CDR is an online event series presented by OpenAir to explore the range of carbon removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and to contextualize them for policy proposals OpenAir seeks to advance at every level of government here in the US, as well as in national and subnational jurisdictions globally. My name's Toby Bryce. I work on policy and market development with OpenAir based in Brooklyn, New York. If you haven't done so already, please tell us in the chat where you're tuning in from, and make sure you direct that to everyone and not just hosts and panelists, so everyone can see who you are and where you're calling from. Just some quick background on OpenAir if you're not familiar with us. We're a distributed all-volunteer network dedicated to advancing carbon removal. We are a global community, and we work together on shared member-led open source missions in the areas of policy, innovation, messaging, and communications, and activist market development. Our co-founder, Chris Neidl, is co-hosting today and also running the chat, and there's a link there to a forum where you can join our group, and we'd love to have you be a part of what we're doing. Here is a graphical representation of sampling of the kind of missions we work on. It's really a wide range of topics and lots of fun things. You can also start your own projects. As I mentioned, we're member-led, member-driven, so you can join and kind of get something going in your own state or jurisdiction. Today, we want to highlight a really exciting project we've been working on, SB 308, which is a really important piece of carbon removal legislation that somewhat magically just passed the California Senate last week, magic through the work of a lot of folks. Chris will put a link in the chat to a tool that we've put together so that if you are in California, you can call your state legislator. Super impactful, particularly if you can call your assembly member. Things are happening as we speak, and would love to have you be a part of what we're doing. We have a similar bill happening in Massachusetts. So also, if you live in Massachusetts, please message us and we can send you a link to the tool for that state as well. As always, just some quick background on defining our terms. This is the IPCC and CDR primer definition of carbon removal, which is purposeful human activity to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and durably store it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in long-lived products. Two really important things to call out when we talk about carbon removal. Number one is to disambiguate it from quote unquote carbon capture, or CCS, which is capturing CO2 from a fossil carbon emission source, cement plant, for example. This may or may not be a good techno-economic solution, climate solution, depending on the techno-economic circumstance. But one thing it's not is carbon removal, which again is pulling CO2 out from the atmosphere and putting it away for a long time. Number two, when we talk about carbon removal, we need to just say repeatedly, loudly, over and over, that carbon removal is in no way, shape, or form any sort of substitute for reducing emissions. We need to reduce all of our greenhouse gas emissions, decarbonize the global economy as quickly and as completely as possible. Full stop. 90+% of our climate work is going to be reducing emissions. Without that work, the 10% or so that we need from carbon removal will be almost pointless because we'll be in such a bad place. So we need to reduce emissions, and then carbon removal is kind of for the last mile, that last 10%. There's clear scientific consensus that this is necessary from the IPCC and others. IPCC in their most recent synthesis report stated that carbon removal is quote unquote unavoidable at gigaton scale by mid-century if we want to have any chance of limiting warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. Gigaton is billions of tons. As you all know, we're currently at kiloton scale, so we have a lot of work to do to advance this sector and scale it to where we need to be in the next 2 decades. I'm going to hand it over to Chris, who's going to talk a little bit about run of show and introduce today's presenter. Chris?
Excellent. Thanks, Toby. Very pleased to be back co-hosting. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. If folks could, if you have questions, and hopefully you do, after Josh's presentation and some prepared questions from Toby, we'll be taking your questions. If you could put those in the Q&A panel, not in the chat, that will allow us to track them much more easily. Otherwise, they'll get lost in the river of chat there. And so I'll pass it off to our guest today, Josh Santos, in just a moment, who will give a short presentation. But before I do, let me go ahead and introduce him. So Josh is a DAC pioneer, friend of OpenAir Collective, and the CEO of Noya. And this is his second time on the show. So we're happy today that he'll be providing us with some updates on his fascinating and dynamic company and the direction that they're going in 2023 and beyond. A little bit about Josh. He's the co-founder and CEO of Noya. This is a company that's reversing climate change by capturing CO2 from the sky via a novel modular direct air capture process. Before starting Noya, Josh took the technical skills he learned during his time studying chemical engineering at MIT and applied them in the business world. After graduating, Josh was the chief of staff at Labdoor, a startup that tests dietary supplements on behalf of consumers, where he built a B2B products and services from scratch. He then went on to become a project manager on the Model 3 program at Tesla, where he helped to scale the production rate of the Model 3 after it launched, and then on to become the first EV program manager in Harley-Davidson's new electric vehicle division. This is where he helped the team scale from 60 to 30 people in the newly opened Mountain View office. Outside of office, you can find Josh reading or sailing in San Francisco Bay. Josh, it's a pleasure to have you back on, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks so much, Chris, and thank you all to the OpenAir community for having me back here. It's been quite a while since we have been here as a team, and since I have been here in front of all of you all. This is CDR, I believe, was in the teens when I did my first show, so it's really exciting to see how much traction this series has really gotten, and it's an honor and pleasure to be back here. I'm really looking forward to updating everybody here on some of the stuff that we've been up to here at Noya. Things have changed. A lot has changed since 2021 when we were last here. So really looking forward to catching you all up on what's been going on and seeing some old faces around here and some new faces as well. During the presentation, we're going to talk about some of the things that have changed since our last time on This Is CDR. We'll talk about our current approach and and provide a little bit of details behind the curtain on some of the technical operations of our process. We'll talk about our scale-up plans and how we're planning to deploy this process out into the real world, and some other fun things along the way as well. So really excited. Please pop questions in the Q&A. I am an open book on pretty much everything. So really looking forward to get into some of your questions later on today. To start from the top, though, Noya's mission is to accelerate the world's transition to carbon negativity. I grew up in the southeast of the US. I went to 13 different schools before shipping up to Boston for college. And growing up, I really saw that hurricanes were the way that climate change was starting to rear its ugly head, at least in the southeast. We had to evacuate many times from different places that I was living, and I really became aware of this issue and saw it firsthand. In my mind, it was the expansion of hurricane season. That was the first thing climate change meant to me. And now I'm living in California. I'm here in San Francisco, and it means a slightly different thing out here in the part of the country that I'm in. So this has been something that I've cared deeply about, and that I wanted Noya's mission to dedicate itself towards. And luckily, we've built a wonderful team to really help us in supporting that mission of accelerating the world's transition to carbon negativity. We've got, myself and my co-founder, who were roommates before we started this in my garage here in the Mission District of San Francisco. And we've got an amazing team of experts from leading companies and academic institutions. And you can see a few of the logos of folks that we've got here on the side. Additionally, we've got a rock star team of investors behind us. Union Square Ventures Collaborative Fund led our Series A couple of months ago. And we've also got the backing of Y Combinator, 50 Years, Lower Carbon Capital, and EQT, which is the third largest private equity group by dollars raised in the world, excuse me. So rockstar team that's really supporting us in building this technology, and some of them have been here ever since the last time we were on This Is CDR. And if any of you have been regular watchers, you may be wondering, well, what the hell's changed since the last time Josh has been on here? So excited to outline that for some of you here and really go into detail for it. The first thing that is probably worth touching on is that when we started as a company, Noya was focused on scaling up this idea of a cooling tower based direct air capture approach. Our whole idea, our thesis, was that by leveraging existing capital equipment that is built all over the country and all over the world, we will be able to deploy and scale up direct air capture in a much faster and easier way. That is no longer what our core focus is. Our core focus is now on standalone direct air capture units, and using the same technology we were building in a cooling tower based application and deploying it in a standalone manner. In both cases, we're taking a modular approach, and that's really something that is going to allow us to scale up, in as fast as we can now, and similar speed to what we were looking at before. Now, for those of you that may have watched This Is CDR or seen one of Noya's old presentations, you might recognize a slide that looks like this, right? This is a slide I showed a couple of years ago during this exact presentation, and it was outlining our specific approach to capturing CO2 from the air. The first step was to retrofit cooling towers on top of commercial buildings and industrial sites. The second step is to transport the captured CO2 to regional removal facilities. And the third step was to permanently remove that CO2. And that's something that we were really excited about and remain really excited about, by the way. I still think this is a fantastic way to scale up a modular approach to direct air capture. We've got, all of our old IP still in place here, and we really are excited about this approach. But something happened that we didn't plan on in between 2 years ago and today. And that thing that happened, we know it as the IRA. The IRA really changed a lot across climate tech, not just in direct air capture, but almost every other flavor of climate tech has some real great juice added to the battery. I almost said fuel added to the fire. Juice added to the battery in terms of how fast we'll be able to deploy and scale. And one of the big things that it impacted for us at Noya is, we had this approach, and this approach was great, and we were really excited about it. But one key requirement in the IRA really made us look hard at this old approach. That key requirement is the minimum project size that 45Q had in the changed language after the Inflation Reduction Act passed. For those of you that may not be familiar, 45Q is a section of the US tax code that subsidizes direct air capture plus storage. It also subsidizes, by the way, point source capture and storage, but direct air capture and storage for our reasons here. And it subsidizes it at a rate of $180 per ton, so long as you are injecting that CO2 underground. There's a separate subsidy if you're utilizing CO2. I'm not going to get into that, but 45Q is a big game changer if you're playing around in direct air capture. But your project has to be 1,000 tons per year or larger in order to actually be eligible for that subsidy. And so we were looking at this and we said, well, cooling towers are great. We got a lot of them. And as it turns out, they're pretty sweet for being able to retrofit. But they do not produce 1,000 tons of CO2 per year, generally speaking. There are some that are large enough to move enough air to then be able to produce that much CO2. But as we were thinking about the path towards the fastest deployments we would be able to get, the largest cooling towers that are able to move enough air to then be warrant of this project size are also owned by people that are just really understandably risk averse, right? They have to keep massive facilities running and are very slow to uptake any new changes to their equipment, generally speaking. And so we're doing the calculus that we could keep doing this, and that's our approach, and we can get this thing, but it's going to take us more development time to get to cooling towers, or we could build our own thing and deploy it in a standalone fashion. And so that's exactly what we decided to do. I'll get more into the technology and the function later on, but in terms of how we were thinking about this new market condition that we never really anticipated, this is really what we saw was the best path forward. And what really enabled us to make this easy, not easy, simple switch is the fact that our team is just incredibly agile and was able to really shuffle all of the same technology and just build it in a new and interesting way. So that's really one of the main motivations that pushed us into the standalone approach rather than a retrofit-based approach. But lots of other stuff has changed as well. When we are on This Is CDR a couple of years ago, we were pre-revenue. We hadn't yet signed our first carbon removal contract. We were just trying to we were trying to close, and we were talking to many buyers, and we had not closed anything yet. Now we have several signed CDR contracts, millions of dollars, thousands of tons worth of removals that we have signed, and it's really exciting. And I think a lot of it is because our standalone approach has allowed us to be able to lock in a lot more, a lot faster than I think we might have been able to previously. So super proud of the team and the speed they moved at for that as well. Last time we were here, we had only raised our really our pre-seed round our seed round from YC 50 Years, Lower Carbon Capital, MCJ Collective, and some other folks. And as I mentioned earlier, we just closed a couple of months ago an $11 million Series A that is really helping us accelerate our growth and scale. Union Square Ventures and Collaborative Fund led that round, and we're super psyched to have them on the team. And obviously, with two legendary funds like that, we're really excited to partner with them to move forward. One last thing that's interesting is that when we were on This Is CDR a couple of years ago, we were focused on CO2 utilization in concrete. The main thing that drove this is the fact that we were modular and distributed, and so it made sense that in urban areas you'd have a high occurrence rate of concrete that you could inject CO2 into. We switched our main removal strategy for now, and we're focused pretty much solely on geologic sequestration. We got an amazing partner that we'll be announcing soon for our first project that we'll also be announcing soon. And I am so excited to be able to partner with this firm who has really built a name for themselves in the underground sequestration area. So super excited about all of that. And as you can tell, lots changed since the last time we were here. We started Noya right before Stripe launched their first ever carbon removal purchase, and it's pretty wild to see how the industry's changed since then. And luckily, we've been able to really be at the front of that and changing as the market has. So that's all great. That's like a high level update. We could end it here, but there's so much more to talk about. For example, let's talk about our technology and what the hell we're building right now. Our main approach is to take the technology we were deploying and developing for our previous cooling tower based approach and really tweak it to be focused on standalone units where we can directly deploy next to geologic injections. So what you're looking at here is that two-phase approach of our direct air capture process. In the first phase, our CO2 capture phase, we are moving air using a fan that we install through an air contactor that has a solid capture material inside of it. If you're familiar with DAC, this sounds, I think maybe like something you may have heard before. Our true differentiation, however, comes in the regeneration phase. The regeneration phase for direct air capture is where you input energy to release the CO2 that you have captured. And for almost every single direct air capture approach, this is the single most energy intensive step. Why? Well, because you have to overcome thermodynamics, right? For CO2 to get captured in the first step, it has to want to be captured, meaning there is some thermodynamic push for it to react with whatever solid material is being used in order to get removed from the airstream that it is flowing in. To undo that, you have to input energy, and generally it's a lot. And so in regeneration approaches across all DAC, this is the single most energy intensive step. All of our differentiation has come in this step because in almost every other direct air capture approach, big pieces of CapEx are used to input energy into this equipment. People are either using kilns, ovens, steam generators, other things that serve the sole purpose of taking in electricity, converting it to heat, and then distributing that heat into the capture material with some inefficiencies due to heat losses out of the sides and time and extra cost and all of these other things. In our approach, because we were retrofitting onto cooling towers, which have generally cramped quarters and there's not that much space, we had to think differently about how we deploy this technology and how we achieve regeneration. And so in our approach, all we need is electricity, and we can skip all of the equipment, the CapEx, the space requirements that you typically see in standard direct air capture via the ovens and kilns and other things. In our approach, we add electricity directly to the material itself, to our capture media, and we flow current straight through it. That current flow is what provides the energy input in order to reverse the capture reaction. We've taken some of the best from electrochemistry and some of the best from solid sorbent technology and have really put it together in this process. We flow CO2 after it's been regenerated through a light vacuum pump to move it out of the equipment, through compression equipment to get it up to injection pressures, and then we hand it off to our injection partner to sequester it underground for permanent removal and storage. So there's a lot here that's been inspired by our cooling tower approach, and something that I think is is really, really unique and truly sets us apart within the space. So at a high level, this is the approach. I'm going to double click on the material itself because it's really what enables all of this. Our SOAR design it combines two incredibly abundant materials for use in direct air capture. The first is activated carbon, and the second is a material that we're holding as a trade secret, but is something that you can buy in have readily available supply chains today. Activated carbon, if you've ever used a Brita filter, it's what's in a Brita filter. That's why a car processes a Brita filter, but for cleaning CO2 out of the air instead of gunk out of water. It's also used in larger scale processing, filtration, and other types of separations. You can buy this stuff in many different locations, in many different areas, in many different spaces, and it's cheap because it's already abundant and available in existing supply chains. Same can be said, all of the same things I just mentioned are true for the capture agent that we're using as well, which we combine with our activated carbon to actually produce the materials that we're using. Those materials look like this. They take the form of what's called a monolith or some sort of structured material. Monoliths were initially used by the automotive industry after the Clean Air Act passed. They're used in almost every single catalytic converter, and they're used because they are great at achieving two things that normally battle against each other. Those two things are achieving a low pressure drop and a high surface area. Usually in materials designs, you can make a material that's over-indexed in one or over-indexed in the other. For a gas separation like direct air capture, and especially for gas separation where the gas you care about is incredibly dilute, the optimization between those two battling forces is pretty difficult. Monoliths are great for that because they have air channels that flow straight through the material. And if you're having a porous material, if you're using a porous material like we are, then you are also able to achieve surface area on the sides of those air channels. So we have a lot of really exciting optimizations that we have done and a lot that we are doing in the material itself. We basically take our activated carbon, we add a couple of other things to it to really form it into this this monolith material that you're looking at on the left here, and then we coat it in the capture blend so that we can create the final sorbent material. So this is all something that's really exciting for us, something that we developed initially for our cooling tower approach because of exactly the constraints we were on, right? Needing to maintain good airflow so that the cooling tower could operate and needing to fit next to the cooling tower were all things we cared about. And so this is ultimately how we were able to achieve that. Now, we take these materials, and I mentioned that we run power straight through them. Well, this is how we do it. We basically connect the material straight to electricity and then run current across it, and we achieve an incredibly high efficiency regeneration process using something called joule heating. Joule heating is a fancy way to say how to heat something up using power. And so this is exactly what we're doing here. You'll see that we have temperature readings on a couple of different areas of this material, and a timer here on the front. This video sped up, but you can see that in under 4 minutes, we're able to achieve the target regeneration temperature of about 120 degrees C. So it's super exciting and something that really allows us to build a leading electrothermal regeneration process. In joule heating, one of the other benefits is that you generally operate much faster cycles than external heating or oven-based heating. We found a paper that was looking at a material using joule heating in a different application, and they were able to run, 7 cycles in the time it took them to run 1 cycle of external heating. And so we're really excited about the process of joule heating, and it's something that isn't really used in many different industries today. It's pretty novel and something that we've been commercializing for direct air capture, specifically with our capture material. So this is all super fun and for us, and something that we've been working hard to start to scale up as we get out of the small material development world into the big capital equipment development land. And this is ultimately the way that we're planning on scaling it up. Earlier this year, we built the first pilot of this technology, and it was something that we were initially thinking about. We built this late last year, and it was something we were initially thinking about for the cooling tower based approach. When we switched approaches and realized we were going to go standalone, we started working on different equipment designs, and this isn't final, but it's getting close to final, and I'm pretty excited about the futuristic way that it looks. But this is going to be the form factor that our first demonstration that's being built later on this year actually has. That project is going to launch at a 1 ton per day capacity, but then we're going to expand at the same facility with the same injection partners and the same power partners to be able to expand the tons that we can deliver. And so that's sort of got a phase 1A and 1B approach for how we're thinking about scaling. And then phase 2 and beyond is to scale up to megaton facility. And that's something that we're really excited about, especially since our modular approach allows us to do that incredibly rapidly. As we scale up and as we develop this product, one of the things that's been really important to us has been MRV and ensuring that we can truly take a transparent and trustworthy approach to how we develop our system. This is a really high level schematic of the intent that we are taking with how we develop and design our MRV system. It's given that we're using a process that has really only 2 inputs, air and power. We can monitor it in a fairly straightforward manner, and we can report on it in an equally straightforward manner. And so that's one of the benefits of our process, that we are able to give incredibly high quality, high trustworthy, highly transparent MRV to our very first customers. And that's what we're planning on doing. There's a suite of stuff that we're planning on installing on our own systems, different temperature, pressure, power readers, and gas flow sensors to be able to track carbon through our process. And the injection partner that we are working with has a similar set of MRV systems for their version of the process. And on top of all of that, we will regularly audit this process to ensure that we can get a very high quality set of trust thrown over it as we scale into the future. So that's a really high level overview of some of the different aspects of our process, our MRV, our scale up plans, and our technology. There's always things that I think we would love some support in, though. A couple of here that I'll mention. We have a few open roles that we're actively hiring for. You can find those on our website, noya.co/careers. Please take a look and reach out if you think any of them might be a great fit for your next step in your career. And we're always looking to talk to CDR buyers. We've got a really long pipeline, and our first tons come online, and our first available tons come online in 2025. But we're always looking to really support companies that are forward looking and trying to be catalytic in a really climate critical area. So if you have any lines of sight to either of those, please shoot me a note, and we'd love to chat. But otherwise, that's all I got here for y'all. So excited to take some questions and see what may be on your mind.
That was great. Thanks, Josh. And again, congratulations on the evolved model and the recent fundraising. That's a huge accomplishment, particularly in this market. So super exciting to see, and can't wait to see what's next.
Yeah, thanks, Toby. Really appreciate that. It's been a lot of fun, and I think our investors are super excited, and we were able to close them even in the current market. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And I see some coming in, but please continue. I'm going to ask a few questions, and then as per usual, we will take as many audience questions as we can handle. So please put those in the Zoom Q&A box so Chris can keep track of them and pose them in a few minutes. So you sort of answered this question, but I just want to double check. When your evolved model, you attributed it to number 1, 45Q macro level incentives, and number 2, possibly slow speed of movement of your potential incumbent infrastructure partners. Were there any other sort of techno-economic issues that you encountered that as obstacles in terms of deploying on sort of that existing infrastructure, which is a very intuitive, lovely idea, but were there other hurdles that you kind of ran into that made it difficult?
Yeah, I think that there are some that there are some things that were hard that we had to think about and figure out, but there weren't any showstoppers. The things that were challenging were some of the things that were very obvious from the very beginning, right? Things like, how do you feasibly move CO2 from a rooftop to wherever a truck may pick it up? There were different buildings that we talked to that had much easier solution sets for that problem than other buildings that we talked to, but that is definitely a challenge with that type of approach. And the second one is ensuring that you line up. This is actually one that is being faced across all types of people's livelihoods, business livelihoods, and I think it's one that's probably common to folks that are deep in climate, and that is how additional electrification tends to have additional costs and timelines. And so if you look at any sort of buildings, some of the ones that we spoke to had enough capacity to host our site, and that was something that was going to be really exciting. Some of the ones that we spoke to didn't, and would have required some pretty big electrical upgrades to be able to host this kind of process on site. And so, I think that like law of large numbers says that as you talk to more and more building owners in more and more places, you will find the places that you need. And we found a few that seem to work with us. But it just, I think as we were taking like looking at the full approach of like what's going to be fastest, what's going to be most viable, what's going to be easiest for us to deploy, and what's going to get us rapid growth through the IRA, I think that, kind of just like stacking these things up, at the end of the day, we had to just make a decision about which one we felt more conviction in the short term. And that was the one that we ultimately made the switch to.
That's great. And that all makes a lot of sense. And one other thing that seems potentially challenging, it's been asserted, and I kind of agree with the assertion, that maybe not for a pilot or a demonstration project, but for scale deployment, any generation needs to be sort of additional to the grid. You shouldn't be taking green electrons off the grid to be doing carbon removal. Is that also a potential issue?
I think that remains an issue for many types of technologies like this. Our first deployment is being built in an area that has incredibly high penetration of renewables, especially geothermal and hydro. And so that makes this a little bit easier to think about and deal with. But yeah, I mean, as you think about how to power this type of approach and process, then I think that it really, you have to sort of balance all stakeholders, right? You need injection or removal, you need power, you need siting. And so I think that balancing all of these things in an urban environment, I don't think it's impossible. I just think it's tough. And with the IRA coming into play, we just wanted to do the thing that was going to accelerate us the fastest.
It makes total sense. And one quick question on your modular form factor. The sort of next milestone is ton a day. Is that one module, or is that like multiple modules in terms of how you think about your form factor, or is it a little more complicated with that than that?
Good question. It's multiple. One module for us is going to be we'll be able to capture somewhere between 3 to 5 tons per day, and that's per year, and that's without any big changes to the materials. So that's going to be multiple modules that we have there.
Got it. So wait, 3 to 5 tons per. So your modules are relatively small. So that's right. Okay. What's like the rough size dimensions? We're building all of the modules up into the sort of like carbon ship device that I showed on the slide here. And that device is, I would say that whole facility is going to require something like, a 100th of an acre to capture 1 ton per day. Okay.
Yeah.
Are the modules sort of self-contained, or is there sort of a balance of plant where there's shared resources between modules?
They're mostly self-contained. They share the fan because we wanted to distribute that cost across many different facilities. And they share other pieces of equipment like compressors and pumps and things like that, but mostly self-contained.
Cool. It sounds like you guys have solved this, but I was going to ask a question. I've heard from, there are a lot of early stage DAC companies trying to scale right now, and there's sort of the long-term challenge of scaling geologic storage and permitting and everything, but there's also this sort of initial challenge for pilot and demonstration deployment that are kind of small in terms of volume, about finding storage partners, because maybe it's too big for concrete, too small for US Class 6 well injection. Like, have you found that to be a challenge, or can you talk generally about how you looked at that? And obviously you found a solution that we'll be hearing about in the coming weeks or months.
Yeah. We're going international with our first build. And so that's our solution. And I probably won't say too much more than that, but I would say that, our general push here is to focus on deployment, because I think that we are, as an industry, at risk of coming off as like long-term science projects unless we start deploying things at scale. And so my general view here is that we need to just start getting tons in the ground. And that's exactly what we're pushing to do and why we've made the decisions that we have about who we're going to work with to start.
Yeah. And in the medium term, have you found, in terms of returning to the US and being able to qualify for 45Q, has that ecosystem been relatively easy to access, or have you found it very challenging to connect with potential storage partners in the US?
It's much less challenging when you are talking about much bigger tons. And so when we start talking about that second phase of growth that we're planning on doing, we're talking about getting up to megaton capacity at one location. And so the phased approach that I'm thinking about, since our process is modular, we'll be able to start with some launch deployment size and then grow from there. So I don't really, there's still the obvious challenges in trying to ensure that you're aligning incentives and that you can find the power you need and that everything lines up in the way you need it to. But as it's seemed to us so far, a lot of the folks that we have spoken with are pretty excited about this approach because we're planning on building something soon, and we're planning on, ensuring that we can prove the tech out as quickly as possible and then go from there.
Awesome. You mentioned CDR buyers, and in talking to early stage DAC companies, there are a couple market leaders who seem to be having maybe not no trouble, but seem to be rolling out new purchases with some frequency, sort of the Climeworks of the world and maybe Heirloom. It seems to me that for pilot scale deployment, when the tons are going to be very expensive, are you finding that there are enough buyers who are willing to pay that sort of premium to help DAC get to scale? And maybe a second part of the question is, there are just so many less expensive BECS tons coming to market in the next 5 years. How do you see that sort of market challenge? And is that like, what would you say to potential buyers and sort of to the ecosystem more generally about how we can kind of address that issue?
Yeah. What we're seeing from buyers is that there's, in many cases, a belief that they will be able to enter the market on the buying side when they are ready to purchase tons, and that point will generally be sometime in 2020X or 2030X, when there will be an abundant supply of carbon removals. And I think that premise is a bit flawed. I don't know of anybody who's planning on having an abundance of carbon removals around that time. I think that the market's going to be pretty supply constrained for quite some time. And so what we're seeing an interest in, especially at this early stage, is that companies are looking to secure future supply right now with us and others. This is sort of the strategic approach that they're taking to ensuring that when their tons get big, they're able to actually get those tons. And they're doing that by making relatively small purchases now. And so I think that companies generally are taking a much longer term view on removals than a sort of like 1 to 2 year outlook, maybe, or at least the companies that are getting in and putting serious dollars down. There are definitely companies that are taking a 1 to 2 year outlook. And, for those companies, the only thing that will ever matter likely is price until maybe that strategy changes.
Yeah.
And so, we like biochar may be the right answer for companies like that. Right. But what we've seen is that the more that we see companies start to realize sort of the quality of credits and the staggering difference between let's maybe separate like nature-based and some of the engineering ones for now. There's a lot of interest in this type of approach, and therefore the prices are tolerable to a subset of buyers. Now, you asked about differentiating between BECS and DAC, and I think between those two, I think again we start to take the long-term view, right? And in the long run, like there will be a point where BECS becomes at risk of needing to trade off land for additional biomass. And not just that, but BECS also has a much harder conversation with a lot of the folks in environmental justice perspective, right? And I don't think all of that's fair. I think there's a lot of great work that many newer approaches have taken to alleviate a lot of the problems of what we have seen from previous attempts, but it's still something that we know people talk about and care about, and it's still something that we think is really important to consider for a lot of the buyers that we're talking to. And so, again, I think that there definitely is price sensitivity in buyers right now. Increasingly, we're seeing more and more viewpoints for what price sensitivity or excuse me, price considerations may be down the line rather than today.
And what would you say, this assertion has been made to me, I think 3 times in the last month or two, that just because of the thermodynamic reality of parts per million of CO2, that DAC will never be able to price compete with BECCS, and it will always be more expensive. And I think you pointed out some like external costs to BECCS that are going to have to get priced in at some point. But how would you respond to that assertion?
Yeah, I would say that it's really hard to make that assertion in a full cradle to grave LCA based analysis, because that assertion, you know, I would be curious about whether that assertion accounts for the external factors required to purify CO2, required to grow the biomass, required to remove any particulate matter, and all of the things that make BECCS, you know, seem like such a home run on the surface. I think that like very little of these things come free. And so I would sort of just be curious to see the fully landed cradle to grave LCA on that.
I do think that there are some BECCS out there that do have some system boundary questions about how that is being computed. And I'm posing the question just because it's out there. I'm not personally advocating for that point of view.
Sure.
One last question before we switch it over to audience Q&A. There was a recent kerfluffle with the UNFCCC. They said some kind of crazy things about carbon removal in an official document that really, I think, opened the sector's eyes to this very important process that's happening with Article 6.4, which is going to be the way that carbon removal gets incorporated into supranational markets. And there's a great reaction from the ecosystem. I think Chris can put some links in the chat. Over 100 companies and organizations submitted comment. OpenAir submitted one that we can put in. Carbon Business Council submitted one that over 100 companies signed. So I think that was really great. And that's just, I think, again, the opening of the eyes, because there's going to be a lot more work to do to kind of engage with this process. But one of the particularly, I would say, outlandish assertions that the document made was that, quote unquote, engineered, which is a problematic label, carbon removal, is incompatible with sustainable development and should not be implemented in developing countries. And I'm not sure if you're going to be implementing, at least in the immediate term, in a developing country, but can you just give a quick reaction to that assertion and talk a little bit about how Noya thinks about the really important issue of wherever you're going to be deploying, doing it equitably and responsibly?
Yeah, it was definitely a shocking assertion to come across, and something that I think, you know, you can see based on, as you mentioned, some of the reactions from the ecosystem and different companies and industry organizations. We participated in quite a few of these letters. We've signed on to a few, and you know, we believe that there is a way to deploy these types of technologies in all ecosystems, in all countries, in all places, that that always keeps in mind the idea of bringing forward the communities and the people that you are deploying with and alongside. During our first deployment, the one that I've alluded to already, we are planning on building on some of the great work in community engagement and stakeholder engagement and management that our injection partner has already started on, and really leveraging some of that as our starting point, but also beginning to build on it and understand what else the local communities that we're building in may care about. I do think that fundamentally, carbon removal actually presents a potentially really large opportunity to deploy into these worlds and present a wealth rebalancing and the beginnings of a new industry in places that could really benefit from it. And so I think that it was unfortunate to see kind of that initial stance taken. I think that, you know, loud voices tend to get heard. And so we are confident that the FCCC will see a lot of the comments from the ecosystem and a lot of the comments from partners like ours, and, you know, begin to rethink this, because, you know, their buddies at the Climate Science Org, they all know that carbon removal is necessary. Like, we all are very aware of it. And so what we're talking about here is are the important conversations that need to be had for something we all agree are good ideas. And so I think that we will get to a place that is much better over time with the right voices in the conversation.
Yep. Really great points. Chris Neidl is going to hop on now and tackle some of these audience questions.
All right, great conversation and great, lot of great questions here. It's good, Josh, that you're a chemical engineer CEO, because a lot of these are pretty technical in nature and some business questions. So I'm just going to run through those. Good question from Claire about energy requirements. And I think you covered this a bit in your presentation, but maybe in a bit more detail about what are the energy requirements of both your capture and regeneration step, and how far are you from the theoretical requirements?
I don't remember them bucketed out into each bucket, but I can say that our long-term energy requirement target is sub 2,000 kilowatt hours per ton. Our first launch will be around 3,000 kilowatt hours per ton, and that's mainly due to some climate considerations that we have to overcome in the place that we're deploying. But that's some of the numbers there. Could you remind me the second part of the question, Chris?
It was just how far are you from the theoretical, I guess, maxims or requirements was the word that Claire used.
Got it. That I would have to check and get back to you. I'm not sure, especially given a lot of the work that we've been doing on the sorbent development, where our current theoretical has fallen. It's been dropping recently, so I rather than saying something wrong, I'll just say that, you know, we are going to try to get as close as we can, and that the exact gap I'm not sure of right now.
Okay, gotcha. And question from Mark, very straightforward one as well, is how do you plan to transport the carbon dioxide from the capture source to the storage source? That would vary by site, I would imagine, but if there's anything you can speak to that would be great.
Yeah, our first couple of sites will just transport it in a pipe. And so that's one of the benefits of co-locating with our injection partners, is that we actually minimize the transportation of any CO2 that we produce. For our first location, we're going to be about, I don't know, 90 feet from the injection well, roughly. And so I'm just going to put it in a pipe and move it there. And that will be the similar case for the second facility as well.
Excellent. And George's question, I think the first part of his question is similar to the first one, but the second one was, how do you cool the bed for the unit after regeneration back to the adsorption temperature?
How do you cool the bed? Yeah, so we mainly use time in that manner. And so there's a step where we are allowing the chamber that holds our material to purge itself of the CO2 that's within it. In that time, we see the sorbent cool to a point where we can then begin the next capture cycle. When we begin the next capture cycle, the sorbent tends to be above ambient, but it very quickly gets back to ambient once we start moving air past it. So I would say that mostly passive considerations are the thinking that we have there.
Great. And I'm not sure how much detail you're going to want to get into a response to this question, but maybe at whatever your comfort level is, or even just conceptually how this would work. But since you're working with a partner for injection and sequestration, how do you intend to split the 45Q tax credits with your partner?
Active discussion.
Figured I would just
probably the best thing to say for that right now. There's no right answer here, especially it being so new. And so I think that we're kind of going back and forth on what may work for them and for us there.
Great. And you may have just sort of touched upon it in the previous question too, but it's just a question about the use of renewable energy electricity and the extent to which that is a sort of a fundamental criteria for all of your projects. And if that is the case, are you looking at in situ installation of solar or wind at your sites for power needs?
For the first facility, so the short answer is yes, we need clean power. The current energy requirements require clean power in order to make the carbon math pencil. And so that's what we're planning to do. We will at our facilities have dedicated renewable builds in order to ensure that we can be additional and you know, to Toby's question and point earlier, to ensure we're not taking green electrons from other places that really need them. We're investigating intermittent use for our DAC as well, and we think that there's a high chance, given just the need for power, that we'll be able to really be successful there. And so we're trying to really be as flexible as we can in the current space as the you know, as the industry in the world begins to scale up and off of dirty power. So the current plan is to deploy our own power next to our facilities. We're looking at intermittent usage of existing assets. And as the grid decarbonizes, this problem gets easier for us.
Great. This is a really good question, and it kind of forces us to be maybe a bit more specific about what we mean by modular design. Sometimes people just think that to mean things that come in small units, but there's a more expanded definition of that. But whatever your definition is, Andre asked a question, everybody seems to view modular design as the answer to scaling up. The advantages seem obvious, but playing devil's advocate, what are some of the drawbacks that you see in a more modular design approach?
The biggest drawback to modular design, I like to, the thing that informs me here is like my experience in automotive, right? So if you're building a car, well, once you sell that car, you no longer have control of that car, right? You could recall it, but that probably is bad. You could upgrade it when people come in, but then how do you ensure that happens? Or you could not do anything and their car experience stays what it is when they leave. That's really the same for us. As I imagine what the scale-up process is going to look like, and as we've gotten deeper into the planning stages for it, it's going to look very similar to an automotive factory in that there are going to be different raw materials that come in, have different steps of value add that they go through, and they all get assembled into one final thing at the end. In automotive, that final thing is a car. In direct air capture, that final thing will be a DAC module. The biggest drawback is that once that DAC module is in the field, it gets a lot harder to make changes to it. And as we develop and as we deploy, we learn about different things that will make the equipment and the process operate more efficient and much better. And so that is generally what we view as one of the biggest drawbacks. The other drawback is that you have to build a lot of a thing, right? So you need to build many modules to achieve scale. I don't think that's the reason I say that as a drawback is because then you have to figure out how to build all of the things that then build that, right? Elon calls that the machine that builds the machine. But that's hard and it costs money. I think it's net good to do that because it allows you to be flexible and to be able to scale up production and to leverage all of the economies of scale that we know exist when you start building the same of many things in a large operation. So I would say that generally speaking, modularity is definitely a big plus here. I think within processing equipment, you tend to have the opportunity to potentially leverage different kinds of economies of scale, which come from just building a huge single thing instead of many bigger, many smaller things. But the trade-off there is that you then introduce a much more complex process into every single site that you build at. So we're planning on using modularity because it allows us to be more flexible.
Yeah, and also from a design perspective, I would imagine it really prioritizes keeping it simple, because if you want to put those modules out there in the world, they have to be, look at solar, could not be more simple in terms of its physical form function.
That's right.
Solid state batteries, that's really, really key. But I think what you just described as a downside has a much heavier upside, that ability to kind of calibrate and change. And I think Toby might have popped a couple of links in there on sort of projecting what the learning rates or cost reduction is with every doubling of production for more modular type of technologies. And they're really, really substantial in most cases. You just see higher cost reduction when you have more modular designs. So another question here is, what's the anticipated, from Andy, what's the anticipated cost per ton for the 1 ton per day pilot?
That is something that we're not sharing quite yet, but it's going to be expensive relative to what our future cost targets will be. Our process, we think, can capture CO2, not remove, but can capture CO2 at around the $60 to $65 per ton cost. But that's at scale. To start, I would say that it's going to be much more than that, and that's just, I think, the thing that comes with early stage technology.
Great. And to the extent that you whatever level of detail you'd want to respond to with this, but Manshu had a particular question about the cost advantages that come from your Joule heating activated carbon approach. So how much of a cost reduction or advantage are you seeing from taking that approach to design?
Yeah, I think what we're really seeing is we're seeing a the numbers I would have to look at and get back to you, but it's at least a 20 to 30% reduction on energy costs. That's mainly because you see a pretty high loss, thermal losses just in operating big hot equipment, right? And then if you've turned on an oven and you're kitchen, you can understand what I mean when I say that. There's also additional cost advantages that we get by being able to deliver all of the power that we need in a very short period of time, so that we can minimize the losses from the material itself into the external environment. And so those are two of the biggest efficiencies we get. We're not even talking about really the efficiency in not having to purchase ovens in the first place and not having to use up space for those ovens. So I'm not really quantifying those, but those are extra savings that we get with our process. And I would say those are some of the bigger ones. I would estimate, just off the top of my head, something like 20-30% increase in efficiency, but the specific numbers I'd have to look up.
Great. And one last question, which is probably a pretty basic one for you to answer. Again, from Claire, how do you intend to source your activated carbon? How will you ensure the CO2 selectivity?
CO2 selectivity is ensured by the agent that we actually coat onto the surface of our material. Our process so far has been able to produce about a 95% purity of CO2 out of the back, and we think that we can make that much better. In terms of how we intend to source it, that's probably something to be shared later on, but what I can say at a high level is that there are not just ways to source it from existing feedstock, which is what we're planning on doing, but we're also at the very early stages of using biomass as a way to actually be able to produce activated carbon, which then yields to, a carbon negative material for being carbon negative, which is pretty neat.
Very, very cool. And with that, sorry, we couldn't get to a couple of questions there, but hopefully most of them were answered. I'll pass back to Toby, but again, just want to reiterate, if you're in California, we have a real chance to pass SB 308, but that will only happen with citizen involvement. So I'm going to pop that link in again, along with the Massachusetts call tool as well, where we have an amazing bill that Toby was very involved in, also making its way through the Senate. So thanks, Toby. Back to you.
Thanks, Chris, and great questions, everyone. Thank you for being with us. And Josh, that was a fantastic presentation and discussion. Really appreciate your time, and onward. Look forward to seeing what's next and hearing this announcement. I have some ideas, but we'll look forward to hearing it.
Thanks so much, Toby, Chris, and the rest of the OpenAir crew. This was a ton of fun, and really looking forward to sharing more about what we're doing in the coming weeks and months.
All right. Thank you. Be well. Just some quick notes to close out from us. I'm going to share my screen. Chris is going to put the Massachusetts and California call links. And seriously, it's super impactful. Even a small handful of calls can move the needle. So really, if you are in those states, encourage you to, in California, call your assembly member. And in Massachusetts, it would be beneficial to call members from both houses. We have really excellent lineup in June, July of This Is CDR. Next week, we have ION, which is a enhanced rock weathering mineralization, XD2 mineralization company that's doing really well out there, and look forward to hearing from Adam Wolf, their founder and CEO, who is quite outspoken and opinionated. So he will be an excellent guest. And then great lineup upcoming for the rest of those 2 months. I put a link in the chat where you can register for all of them. Unfortunately, Eventbrite does not let you register for all of them at once, but you can register for the ones that you would like to attend. And we look forward to seeing you again next Tuesday, noon Eastern, with Ion and Adam Wolf. Thank you again for being with us. And Josh, that was fantastic. Thanks again, and be well, everyone, and see you soon.